At my lowest, I felt broken, lost, and trapped, like I was an absolute failure. And from that valley of darkness, I've emerged more whole and wise, more balanced and energized. I'm now willing and able to continue my life-changing work without it overwhelming me and consuming me. And I want every health worker to know that that is available to them and that they can feel like this.
Life's fuel is emotion. When our emotional tanks are empty, we cannot serve. Knowing how to recognize when you are at empty and how to refuel allows you to be in service of your life's purpose.
49% of healthcare workers are at breaking point. Is that you? Perhaps someone you live or work with?
Uncontrolled, burnout becomes trauma, and that can lead to disaster, even suicide. I've seen that with my own eyes, and I'm sure you have too. This webinar is intended to help you recognize and understand burnout in yourself and others to develop ways to avoid the syndrome and treat it if it becomes manifest. Hello, my name is Jonathan Sackier. I'm a surgeon and co-founder of the Reticular Formation. I'm joined by my co-founder, Dr. Nigel Guest, who's a practicing family clinician, a long-time and very dear friend, and a respected colleague.
Thanks, John. To help us explore this important topic, we're joined by Dr. Rola Hallam, award-winning anaesthetist and humanitarian. She's a TED Fellow and global speaker who has helped build 7 hospitals, including the first ever to be crowdfunded, together impacting over about 4 million lives. Her work is featured in the media from the New York Times to the BBC, and her online talks have been viewed over 11 million times. Rola works as a trauma-informed burnout coach. Welcome, Rola.
Thank you for having me.
We're also joined by Dov Baron, a man I've known for many years and who helped me deal with some personal life traumas, becoming a dear friend in the process. A prolific author and speaker, Dov has been named as one of the top 30 global leadership gurus, as Inc. magazine's top 100 leadership speakers, and has helped individuals and multiple companies and organizations, including the United States Air Force and Department of State. By synthesizing a robust understanding of neuroscience and comprehension of human behavior, he's the authority on our individual emotional source code, more of that later, and, if you will, the anatomy of meaning.
We're going to run through a number of discussion points, provide you with access to helpful assets, and provide clarity and hope. Given the audience size, please post questions and we'll endeavour to answer them in due course and in future webinars. You'll be able to find out more about Dov and Rola in the show notes, including links to the websites, books, and other things. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website, thereticularformation.com. And as you'll hear later, this webinar is just the first of a series of offerings of this nature that we'll have for you. So please register on the website to stay informed.
And please remember to claim your free audiobook on the link you were sent or in the show notes. Okay, our first topic is to define what we're talking about. The 11th revision of the International Classification of Diseases states that burnout is a syndrome conceptualized as resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed, with 3 elements characterizing the condition: physical or emotional exhaustion, or both, reduced efficiency, and a sense of negativity. These might be triggered by the sufferer perceiving lack of control, vague expectations, an unpleasant, chaotic, or boring work environment, loneliness, or a lack of work-life balance. Rola, let's start with you. Your comments, please.
I think I agree with all of that, but it just seems so beige compared to the real life darkness of how burnt out felt for me. I remember the moment when I was speaking on the BBC and I just had this out of body experience when I was just suddenly thought, I can't keep doing this. I can't keep going on. I just can't believe I've been doing this for 10 years. I can't believe I'm talking about another hospital being bombed, another school being bombed. I felt like such a failure. And from that day on, I just knew that I had to stop because I felt like I couldn't go on any further. My whole sense of worth had been brought into question. I would have, my emotions were all over the place. I was either sobbing one day or furious and angry the next day. I knew I was empty and just couldn't go on anymore. And so I'd say that's the rock bottom. What a lot of us don't recognize as the warning signs, of which I had plenty of in hindsight, such as the reactivity and the frustration and all of those things that we all know. But unfortunately, many of us don't realize that till we hit rock bottom, as I did.
It's interesting, Rola, that, you know, anyone looking in from the outside, and I know where Dov's going to go with this, would say, my God, what an incredible woman. You know, the work you did in Syria, you're a doctor, you've got a great personal relationship, you probably, you know, your bank account is probably at least reasonably healthy. She's got it all, yet inside you were wrecked. Dov, I'd like you to jump in, and I'd also like you to address, you know, the definition talks about the workplace, but it's not just the workplace that can do this to us, right?
Thank you. No, of course, it's not just the workplace. The thing about burnout is that it's accumulative. And so you can be getting sort of fueled in one area and completely drained in another, but you can be drained in multiple areas. So you can have a personal relationship that's challenging, let's use that term, that's challenging at home with a family member or whatever it is. And then you go to work and that can just push you over that edge. And as Rola stated just a few moments ago, there are so many signs that we just don't pay attention to. We're all running around with these metaphorical capes on, pretending to be heroes. And we want to be heroes. Let me be fair. It's not that we don't want to be. We want to be heroes. We want to help. We want to serve. And we take that on without examining ourselves. So we lose the intrinsic focus while we're extrinsically focused. We're looking at the world and saying, how can I serve? And then we're burned out and we maybe hit the wall and we realize it. And then someone else comes along and says, can you help with this? And you're already on that automatic process of helping others. It happened to me. It's happened to everybody here. And for some of us, we will find a way to have ourselves recognize that burnout when it's too late. Well, I always say that the soul whispers until it has to shove you off a mountain, which it did in my case.
Literally and not metaphorically.
No, literally.
Before we, yeah, literally, Dov fell off a mountain and spent a lot of time in hospital. Before we come to Nigel, I would like you, Rola, to list 2 or 3 things that you noticed, just bullet points, 2 or 3 warning signs that you ignored. And Dov, then I'd like you to come in with 2 or 3 that she didn't mention.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll tell you what I wish in hindsight I recognized as some of those signs. The brain fog that I had, the poor memory, the insomnia, the chronic pain in my back. I had the shame and guilt that was driving me. Every time I wanted to look after myself, to take a break, to go on holiday, I didn't realize that shame and guilt was such a sign of trauma, of grief, and of burnout. So those for me were some of the less obvious signs and symptoms that I now look out for in my clients when I work with them, because I feel they are some of the ones that we know less frequently than some of the ones we've already listed.
Dov, anything to add to those?
Those are really great, and they pretty much cover it. The only thing I would add to that is this piece I said about this hero complex. And let me be clear when I say hero complex, this is not narcissistic hero complex. This is a desire to serve, a desire to help. And at the same time, as Rola stated, the feeling of helplessness. So I want to help, but I'm incapable of helping at the degree that I want. So I'll push myself to help even more so that I can alleviate this guilt that I'm feeling because I want to do more. And in the process, you go from being full to empty, and then from empty to your reserve tank until that's empty. And that's when you hit tragedy in your own life.
Yeah. Nigel, jump in.
Yeah, we talked about the definition and workplace, but I think it's all aspects of our lives that contribute to burnout, but they also contribute to prevention and also to resolution. I think the key thing is to identify which are which, and the key is to use those to their maximum, isn't it? And identify them and just move on, addressing those issues as they come. So our next topic, and going to touch on that, we've talked about the signs and things and experience, but our next topic really is the etiology. What causes it? Dov, you first.
Well, as I said, I think what causes it is this desire to serve. I mean, let's face it, if you're in the healthcare environment, you are likely driven by some part of you, we call it your emotional source code, that says, I want to serve in the world. I want to make a difference. I care. And the problem with that is if that becomes the identity that drives you, you very quickly lose sense of yourself. If you lose sense of yourself, you're no longer able to serve. You're now operating like a machine that will eventually just run out of energy and run out of, just break down. So when we look at it in that sense, when we say, okay, so where does this start? Like, what causes it? I would very simply say the cause is simple: a lack of self-awareness. So just stop and pause. And one of the techniques I've taught every client I've ever worked with is the ability to create the pause. When somebody asks you to do something, you respond with, I'd love to. Can you just give me a couple of minutes to think about that? Or can I get back to you in 24 hours if it's not an emergency? Giving yourself that pause time to just move out of that amygdala response, out of that franticness, to just breathe. Because if you're in a burnout state, everything is an emergency. Please understand that. Everything is an emergency. And one of the simplest, quickest ways to move yourself out of that anxiety state is your breath. So by pausing and learning how to do 3 or 4 box breathing, which is 4 in, 4 hold, 4 out, you begin to pull the blood back into the prefrontal cortex, into the part of your brain that allows you to think clearly and to just calm the whole central nervous system down. So that's where we can really begin to notice how it kicks in.
Rola, what about your view on causes?
So I'd like to first of all reference the fact that many of us are subjected to external environmental issues, which absolutely contribute to it. Most of us are short-staffed, under-resourced, and that I have experienced myself. When you know you are not providing the optimal medical treatment to one of your patients, it's devastating to us as healthcare workers. That moral injury really needs to be recognized. And I'd like to circle back to it in a minute when we talk about, in a minute, but we first of all, can I edit? Can I start again, please?
Yeah.
So I want to first of all reference the fact that there are many external environmental issues that do lead to our burnout. We are under-resourced, we are understaffed, we are overworked. The moral injury of knowing you are providing suboptimal medical care is really injurious. It's personally been devastating to me when I have experienced that, whether in the NHS in the UK or whether in Syria or in any of sub-Saharan African countries I've worked in. It does not feel good when you know this is not how you'd want your daughter to be treated. But I want to flag the fact that when we are purely in that blame on the external circumstances, when we are in that so-called victim stance, that is one of the red flags of burnout. When you are not able to, as Dov just said, have the awareness about how might I be contributing to it. So I don't want to blame and say this is our fault, but I would like to say that there are so many internal or individual issues that we all do that then contribute to it. And that's where we can control and where I'd like to raise the awareness. Absolutely, as Dov said, there's the savior complex, and that certainly was one of the issues for me. You know, you put the weight of the world on your shoulders. You feel like you want to try and save everyone. The more suffering you witness, the more that you want to alleviate that suffering, and it's beautiful. But it ends up leading into empathetic distress, and it ends up leading into what we erroneously call compassion fatigue, which is actually not compassion fatigue at all. It is empathetic distress that then ends up burning us out. And then on top of it, we prioritize everyone and everything else except ourselves. So many of us think self-care is a luxury or selfish, and so we don't practice it. Like me, perhaps you're driven by guilt and shame, and you say, what are people going to say if I'm now taking a holiday? And so instead of listening to your wiser, knowing self, you listen to that judgy, critical part, and you don't do the things that you know you really need to. But the one major thing that I would really like to underlining all of this, which I didn't realize was my case, and I believe it is the case for most of us health workers, is trauma. And I want this to be like big, like if I could just put this on the screen now with red bells, then I would be so pleased with that, because we underestimate the chronic, frequent, repeated, heartbreaking things that we witness. That child who dies at the end of your syringe, the 24-year-old suicide person you couldn't bring back. So many of these patients, we all know them, right? If I paused now for a second, I bet you can think of those patients who are staying with you. Each one of them stays with us. Each one of them injures us. When we don't pay attention to that, it dysregulates our nervous system. And then that ends up permeating everything. Our body, our cognition, our heart, our soul.
So sorry.
Well, you know, it's timely you say that, because we are actually going to come on to damage to the nervous system, Rola. Can I jump in and just make a couple of observations? I'm sitting here nodding a lot because I recognize in myself those experiences and in my colleagues. And there was a paper, I forget who wrote it, but it was surgeon as second victim. Right? When something goes wrong, you know, the general public have this perception that we're dispassionate as physicians and we don't get involved. Nothing could be further from the truth. My experience of our colleagues is that they are kind, caring, and compassionate souls. And secondly, Dov, I'm going to shamelessly quote you. I said in my opening comments how you worked with me, and you taught me some things. You taught me about martyr syndrome, you know, being a martyr, and that makes you a victim, and it becomes a vicious, vicious, vicious cycle. You also taught me a great quote, that we seek the teeth that match our wounds. So something injures us in life, and it doesn't go according to our plan, and we try to recapitulate the situation as if it was a medical treatment that has suddenly been improved and we can now get it right, but we don't. But we don't even recognize that this is going on. So bless both of you. I think you're bang on target. I think we should move on a little bit, but I guess also to acknowledge this is a webinar intended for healthcare practitioners. Burnout can affect anyone in any sphere of life. I just think that we're probably a little bit more likely to get it because of the motivations for what we do as a profession, and also because medicine has become more complex and it's also become more bureaucratic. And with bureaucracy comes a lack of control and a disharmony between what you want to do and what you can do. And Rola, you said trauma. In my opening comments, I said that burnout can lead to trauma. And I had a colleague, I know I've told you guys this story, a colleague a number of years back who was an amazing surgeon and a lovely human being. And one day it was just all too much. And he drove into the desert and took his own life. And it was devastating for everyone. Rola and Dov, who wants to go first and talk about trauma?
Go ahead, Rola.
So for years, I marveled at how untraumatized I was, considering how much suffering and devastation I had witnessed in Syria. And I think it really is testament quite to the, could call denial, could call ignorance of what trauma actually really is, because I believe most of us really associate trauma with PTSD. You know, we all think that unless I'm having flashbacks and nightmares and the kind of extreme ends of the symptoms and signs, well, then I'm not traumatized. And that's exactly what I thought. But actually, I've come to realize that it is trauma isn't what happens to you, but it's what happens inside of you because of what happens to you. It's a quote by the great Dr. Gabor Mate, and really that's referring to the physiological nervous system changes that happen to us when we are when we go into a survival state, right? So when we enter fight and flight and we stay in it, so often we get stuck in it as health providers. We have chronic stress, chronic toxic stress, every day the same. We end up with that nervous system that is going and going and going. It becomes your norm. You don't actually recognize that you're in that fight and flight. Honest to God, it took me about 6 months into my healing journey to suddenly actually realize I was stuck in fight and flight. It was such a palpable change within me that I was like, oh, I didn't realize how wound up I was all that time because it had become my norm.
We're going to come on to that, and we're going to dig down into that, Rola. So thanks for surfacing that sort of like foreshadowing in the movies. Dov, what about your perspectives?
Well, I think that, as Rola just stated, the problem is that we mix these two things up, trauma and burnout. One can lead to the other. Burnout doesn't necessarily lead to trauma. You can catch it before it gets to that. But the challenge is in the normalization, as was mentioned. And I really want to drive that home. So let's talk about trauma in this context. We think of trauma as a dramatic event. So you were in a building, the building blew up. In my case, I fell off a mountain, or my house burned down, or maybe you got a divorce, or maybe you got a horrible diagnosis, or you went bankrupt. These are all traumas that are big events. But what we don't realize is trauma is accumulative as well. So what do I mean by that? If you are a child, I know this is a horrible vision, but just bear with me for a moment. You're a child, you're 7, 8 years old, and you walk in the house after you come home from school and your dad punches you in the head. That's a trauma. Everybody agrees with that. But what if you're a child and you're in bed and every night somebody drops one drip of water on your forehead at 2 a.m. every night for a year? The problem is you'll say, I wasn't traumatized because it's minimal, but it's accumulative. And it's actually even more destructive on your nervous system because your nervous system sits in weight of that. So there are many things you've normalized in your life that have become trauma. And the problem with that, with trying to manage that, is now your entire system is playing into that traumatized state, is at that hypervigilant state where your nervous system is on edge, where the reticular system is freaking out and paying attention with hypervigilance. And then you're in a situation that pushes you over the edge, that is the quote burnout, that now pushes you into a cycle where you're having to face the trauma. So oftentimes, this is what's really important. Oftentimes, burnout is a catalyst to actually seeing, to paying attention to the trauma you have normalized to cope with your life. This is what's key.
It's interesting that both of you are doing this brilliantly. You're foreshadowing what's coming next. You know that I've been a pilot for many years. And when one has had, just for those who are not pilots, it's very rare to have a problem in an aeroplane. But when you have a problem in an aeroplane, you have been trained so methodically to deal with it in a rational way. The well-trained pilot just takes it in there. In fact, I would say when I was flying an aeroplane, I was in my most relaxed state. And when things did happen, and they did because I flew a lot, one just dealt with it. So thank you for the foreshadowing. Nigel, you must have seen this sort of situation in your practice. Tell us about it.
I have, and I've seen it over the years, not only in patients, but also in my colleagues. And I think it's a thing that's become far more common, or far more recognized, or certainly more talked about. At the moment, I have one or two junior doctors who I'm dealing with at the moment, and I think that they are finding the system within the NHS, and I'm sure it's true wherever you are in the world, quite difficult in terms of their training, their competence, their self-perception in terms of their abilities, and that links to what we were talking about before. But with COVID, I think it's created another element as well. And I think you'll all find, I mean, the pandemic is being blamed for a great deal of the current focus on burnout, the great resignation, if you will. And I know, Dov, you've talked about normal a lot. What is normal?
So I just want everybody to just pause for a moment and think about how often you use that language. It's just normal. You know, you have a friend who's going through, it's just normal. Well, how do you qualify normal? So here's what I want you to really get. Normal isn't healthy, or normal isn't necessarily healthy. Normal's just whatever you got used to. And if you grew up in an environment that normalized trauma, trauma's normal. If you grew up in an environment where you as a kid were never in a space where you could relax, let's say you grew up in Syria during the devastation, you don't know how to play. Right? You may have played, but you don't know how to play because playing is not normal. Being terrified is normal. So you live in this state of normalization. So normal isn't necessarily healthy. And this is one of the clues of where you can pay attention to where you're moving towards burnout, is to watch for how you're normalizing a situation. I'm a healthcare worker. You know, it's normal for us to do 14, 15, 20, 22 hours a day. It's not normal. It's freaking insane. It's going to burn you the hell out, and you're not going to be able to serve. Listen, your brain is, you know this, your brain is not going to function at the highest possible level if you're already exhausted. So normal isn't healthy. Normal's whatever we got used to. Now, the challenge with that is if you got used to trauma in your childhood, you're now operating in a traumatized state as normal. And the challenge with that is this: if somebody presents you with a healthy normal, it feels traumatic. Just pause on that for a moment. I want you to get that. Normal isn't necessarily healthy. Normal's whatever you got used to. And if somebody presented you with an environment that was actually normal and healthy, you would treat it like a trauma, i.e., you're working in Syria, there's things going on that are devastating, and then you get to go away and be on holiday as a normal person would, healthy person who's taking care of themselves would, and you feel massive amounts of anxiety. Why the hell am I anxious? There's no bombs going off. There's nothing happening, because normal becomes the trauma then, because your system is so set for this traumatized state. This is vital for you to recognize so that you can begin to start unwinding this process of how you've been traumatized and you've gone into burnout. And those two things have now collided and you can't really pull them apart.
Yeah, Rola, I see you nodding there, and I'm interested to hear A, your experience, and B, your view.
Oh my God, that actually happened to me, Dov. Like, I actually remember that, like coming back from Syria, and I couldn't stand how normal everything seemed. At one point, actually, I only know this in hindsight that this was trauma, but at one point I was so angry towards people seemingly having normal lives when mine had been torn apart and thrown upside down. But what I wanted to follow up with on Dov's excellent point is that, you know, we all have, when we get stressed, an adaptive response. What does that mean? We lean on all of the assets that we have that help us to keep resilient: our emotional connections, our intimate relationships, family, friends, exercise, etc. When stress becomes chronic, when we add to it some of this trauma of the experiences that we go through, we enter into a maladaptive response. So I want to take this opportunity to maybe just help our listeners to pause and think about, what might you be doing, or how might you be acting in ways that are actually counter to your health and wellness? Whether that is smoking too much, drinking, well, smoking at all, drinking too much, you know, we're not exercising, we are cutting ourselves off from others because we feel ashamed or we feel no one understands us. Like that was a major one for me. So many of us go into ourselves because we've got a vulnerability aversion. I can't possibly tell people I'm struggling. What will they think of me? So we really isolate ourselves on top of it. So just take a moment to pause and just try and see that with love and kindness to yourself. This is not about judgment, but just to help us all flag how we may be behaving in ways that are maladaptive, because these are, again, some of the signs that perhaps you have overstretched yourself and you're going to need to do something in order to bring yourself back into the window of tolerance of your nervous system, that place where you are feeling more calm, more connected, more creative, and more socially connected as well.
Jonathan, your view?
You know, again, I'm thinking of an aviation corollary. I'm very fortunate to have some friends who are astronauts, and these are the finest of the finest men and women who are trained to a level of peak cooperation in a perfect environment, and then they're not, and they come back. And a lot of them really, really struggle to work in earthbound pursuits because it's, quote, not normal for them anymore. And I think I'm reflecting on, and having gone through my trauma, nothing like your trauma, Rola, but for me it was traumatic. It wasn't till friends, people who cared about me, really forced me to look in the mirror and go, this sucks. This life sucks. And if I hadn't had those friends support me, the problem is self-fulfilling prophecy. If you are in that situation and you've self-isolated and you're self-harming effectively, how can people reach you? It's damn difficult. We are going to come on to some of the approaches and some of the assets in a short while. But one of the perspectives I wanted to raise, in our society, problems become causes when a celebrity gives them a voice and a face. And I'm thinking here, Magic Johnson and HIV/AIDS. You didn't talk about HIV. That was a thing of shame in community until this guy, I mean, his first name, for goodness sake, Magic, right? People stopped, right? And then Michael J. Fox, Parkinson's. Suddenly it's okay to talk about these things. Who's going to be the cause célèbre, the face of burnout? Or is there just simply put too much shame? You know, Dov, you've talked about having this superhero self-image. I can't possibly show weakness. Rola, do you agree with that? Nigel? So I'd like to go in that order. Rola first, then Dov, and then Nigel, and then Dov. Maybe that's a good time to explain what's meant by emotional source code, and you can explain that concept to folks. So Rola, Nigel, Dov.
I don't know that we need a celebrity face, but what I do know is that we need to normalize talking about this, that we need to make it okay for us to stand up and say, I'm struggling. I don't feel good. And I think that takes more than celebrity, it takes leadership. It takes us senior physicians, it takes our senior nurses, it takes us in the leadership and seniority positions to embrace our own vulnerability and to actually not only embody it, but to display it and demonstrate it to our junior doctors. When we, as the more senior ones, are willing to say, that death really affected me, or whatever it is, you know, I'm exhausted today, I'm not having a good day, whatever your truth is, you're going to open up the space for other people around you to be open and trusting. So for me, it's really about that leadership and embracing that openness and vulnerability, and moving away from that being a shameful thing. But just to remind all of us, shame is a sign of trauma. And so if you are feeling ashamed about your struggle, then please know this is a red flag that you may be having signs of trauma, because I did not know that until I hit rock bottom, and I wish I had done.
I think you're absolutely right, Rola. And I think back to our training going way back, certainly in Jonathan and my case, in terms of how we were meant to be special, how we were developed, almost invincible, and you didn't show any signs of being traumatized. You didn't show any signs of even emotion, really, in terms of the multiple traumas you had within your experiences, and that continues. And you're absolutely right, is that we have the responsibility to consider that in our juniors, and their pressures are so much different, and their pressures in their lives are so much different. And I think we have, an absolute responsibility to encourage our senior colleagues to behave in a better way towards juniors, but also to encourage that conversation, that discourse, and to be supportive. In that way, we'll have a better working profession, but also have a more balanced and less traumatized profession, I think. And I think that's incredibly important.
Absolutely agree. As Rola said, do we need a celebrity? Yeah, we live in a celebrity-driven world, so we probably do need a celebrity to come out and talk about it. But having said that, it is an act of leadership, as Rola stated. And what is leadership? Well, you know that I speak on leadership around the world. And if I'm defining leadership as one simple thing, it's permission. Leadership is permission. So as you lead, you give permission to everybody you lead, right? So the vitriol that we've seen in American politics in the last little while has come from permission from a leader who behaves that way. And so it allows others to do the same. Well, think about that in a positive way. Think about Martin Luther King, how it gave permission for people to stand up about things they were not happy about. Gandhi, Nelson Mandela. Leadership is permission. So if we stand up and say, this is not okay, as a leader of your organization, of your group, of your team, of your family, then we start to model that. Now be clear, standing up and saying it's not okay is not enough. You must model it. You must demonstrate it. This is vital. So let's take that into something that I talk about, as you can see down in the corner of my screen, emotional source code. Because I want to explain emotional source code from the state of what's kind of going on in the world today. We have something that you're probably familiar with, particularly if you run a team, which is called the Great Resignation or quiet quitting. The Great Resignation is this massive lack of talent. You used to have 100 on your team, now you've got 70, or you used to have 20 on your team and now you've got 7, and you're like struggling. Everybody's working double time trying to, where did everybody go? Where did everybody go? Here's what's fascinating. The Great Resignation is not a first world problem. We thought, oh, well, it's the big workforce, right? It's I've got more freedom of choice. I live in this democracy, and I can hold on. Vietnam is dealing with the Great Resignation. China is dealing with the Great Resignation. These are places where people don't have a lot of those kinds of choices, and they're going, I'm done. I'm going back to the village. Because I believe the pandemic was the great pause. We were all on this treadmill, and as Rola talked about, we were running at massive speed and not even noticing that we were burned out. We were living in this expectation of our own expectations and what we perceived as the world's expectations of we've got to hustle to get along and do better and make the world better and be better and put in more time and more energy, and we ended up fried. The pandemic came along and it was like, instant break. Everybody stopped, and there was a trauma. Oh my God, the panic's on. I can't do my work. I can't do my things. And we went into a trauma from that. And then we started to adjust, like Rola talked about, there's an adjustment period. We adjusted and we started to, we missed our community. Terrible. Human beings don't do well in isolation. But oftentimes, if you had a family, you got more bonded with them. You sat with them. You went home. You were home. You had dinner with the kids. You listened to your children. You helped your kids learn at school. You sat with your wife or your husband or your partner, and suddenly you had this bond. So on one side, you're traumatized from the isolation to the world, but you're actually bonded to your own family. And that was the pause. The pause was, why am I doing what I'm doing? We don't give ourselves the opportunity to pause. And the challenge is that when the brakes came off, many people ran back into their normal, which is whatever they were doing before. So they've gone back to that hustle, they've gone back to that, but they're already burned out and traumatized from what happened in the pandemic, whether it was hands-on for you as a healthcare worker or just generally as an environment. You've now got this burnout and trauma going on at the same time, but you've also got a values reassessment that happened. You're starting to pause and look at that. So let's just take that back a little bit into you meaning me, all of us individuals. We have what I call your emotional source code. Your emotional source code you might think of as your emotional DNA. It's what you were given by your original environment. And it tells you what normal is. And from that, you start to build an identity. And your identity says, this is who I am in order to survive this environment. We're trying to survive. We're all trying to survive. And so you build an identity to protect yourself. Now, if in that identity, I'll give you an example. In my childhood, I grew up, I was the eldest child of a bunch of kids. My dad left when I was 7 and told me I was the man of the house. Not a great message for a kid. Thank you for stealing my childhood, Dad, you wanker. I'm done, right? My childhood went out the window. So now this is my normal. So I'm learning right away that I got to take care of my mom, who's devastatingly depressed, and I got to take care of my siblings. My emotional source code is giving me that. My identity becomes that I'm the caregiver. I'm the rescuer. So what do you think I did in my life if that's my identity? That's what I did. My emotional source code has set me up for that, as that's normal. What did your emotional source code set you up for as an identity? Because the identity is not you. The identity is what you built in order to survive the environment. And you go, well, my childhood was wonderful. Well, as John Bradshaw, Dr. John Bradshaw said, 97% of families are dysfunctional and the other 3% are freaking liars. What does that mean? It doesn't mean that your dad beat you every day or you were molested. It doesn't mean that. Remember that drop, that drip, 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 drip. The trauma can be small, but it's accumulative and it's impacted your system for coping with stress. Now, some of that has got great things and it's allowed you to do amazing things, allowed you to become a surgeon or a pilot or a doctor or to work in sub-Saharan Africa and do amazing work. Of course, that's the gift of it. But the downside of it is it's allowed you to ignore your own system. And that's where you end up in burnout because of a root in your emotional source code of your identity that is trauma not dealt with. If you want to get better at dealing with the situations, do yourself a favor. Self-knowledge. Be willing to have the courage to look within. You're incredibly courageous in the way you take care of others. And I would guess, in most cases, you're a bloody coward at looking after yourself. Sorry, you might not like that. You might find that a bit in your face. I am that guy. But if you're being courageous in the world and you're not being courageous with yourself, you're not having the courage to look at yourself, you're not serving at your full capability. And the world needs you to do that. And you can't do that on an empty tank.
Thanks, Dov. That's certainly one to reflect on. And I was thinking, as you were saying that before, about parents and families, about the great quote, which I won't say here because of the expletive, from Philip Larkin, which I think we all know. John, I think Confucius once said that when anger rises, think of the consequences. So thinking about some of the physical aspects of this, can you set up the discussion about the autonomic nervous system, the problems that can flow from it? And perhaps, Lola, you could talk to us about what you've seen in the war zone and elsewhere, and then pass the baton to Dov, who can provide his perspectives. So over to you.
So thanks, Nigel. I like that, Confucius. So everyone knows that we've got our sentient nervous system, if you will, and then we have our autonomic nervous system that's comprised of two components: the sympathetic, which is fight, flight, or freeze, and the parasympathetic, which is rest and digest. So, you know, this is a little bit sophomoric, and I apologize for that, but for people who haven't thought about it through this particular filter, it's helpful. So if you were our prehistoric ancestor and you faced an existential threat, right? You come out of a clearing and you're face to face with a large predatory carnivore. I'm not going to embarrass myself and name a species because I'll be told they never coexisted. So one of two things happens. The animal either pounces and eats you, in which case, who gives a damn about your nervous system response, or your sympathetic kicks in and you either hit it with a rock, run like the Dickens, or freeze in the hope that it won't see you. And then one of two things happen. You either get away, in which case, relaxation, resolution, or he eats you, right? In which case it doesn't matter. When you get back to your dwelling, you can rest and digest your food, and you're in the parasympathetic state. We all know what sympathetic tone feels like. It's going in to do our exams. It's dealing with a contentious work colleague, or a difficult patient, or a difficult relative, heaven forbid. And we know that those situations can be self-limiting, or they can fester on, and they disturb our sleep because we're worried about them. The problem is when those, just to use Dov's torture analogy, drip, 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 your sympathetic tone just goes up and up and up. Your blood pressure goes up, your pulse rate goes up, you're secreting hormones that we know are not good for you. It has all sorts of health consequences, including reduced lifespan and reduced health span. So this is very, very real, very tangible, and it is addressable in some ways, but we'll come on to that in a short while. So I hope that's a sufficient setup to pass it on to you, Rola.
Yeah, Jonathan, that's great. And you know what? I really love the polyvagal theory that a lot of trauma experts now teach, which is exactly what you said. There is this sympathetic fight and flight, which I call my dragon state. You know, I'm imagining fire coming out of practically every orifice. You know, this is a state of survival through action, right? So we all know that. But what most of us only pay attention to is actually when we go into the second survival state, which is the survival by disconnection. That is when we go into one aspect of the parasympathetic state, which is the dorsal ventral state. Now, this is when we enter despair. I call it my crab in a shell. You just go into yourself. You don't care anymore. You have no energy. You're despairing. You're feeling hopeless. What can I do? I'm useless. I'm a failure. Everyone around me is a twat. and that state of disconnection, that exhaustion, I can't go on anymore, is when we often is that hitting rock bottom, when we suddenly start to pay attention to it. What we all want to be in is what we call the window of tolerance, that state of the vagal ventral state, when we are in a state of calm and connection. You called it the rest and digest, right? That is, interestingly, that is when we are connected to our creativity, to our critical thinking, to our problem solving, to our social communications. And so here's the thing. If we are all, as health workers, in a survival state, then that means most of us are not in a state of connection with one another. We are not feeling each other's emotions. We are not in a state of nurturance and in connection. I'm not really actively listening to you. I'm not even, that's the brain fog. That's the I can't think, that poor memory. That is all a sign that you are not in your window of tolerance. You're not in that vagal ventral state. You're not in your calm state of connection. There are so many things, like Dov said, that we can do after we have been activated, such as the breath is our most powerful weapon and tool to bring ourselves back into a state of calm and connection. And I think this is one of the things I'd wish I'd been taught. Instead of going from one emergency to the other, what micro practice can some of us do for just 2 minutes? Hand on chest. Do the box breath, as Dov said. Actually, you can do, I say, like, you've got this, everything's fine, or I can acknowledge a feeling that was awful. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. Use that breath. Literally, it takes 2-3 minutes to just bring yourself back into a state of calm and connection. And what that does is maintains nervous system flexibility, right? Because this is the problem, is if we end up, like I said, chronically stressed, chronically in that activation state, we get stuck in it, we get inflexible in it. And that's when we end up kind of zigzagging all over the place, reactive 1 minute, completely shut down the next minute. We're yo-yoing and roller coasting all over the place. It's actually beautiful. It really, like, studying it and then seeing it in myself was just, it really tickled the geek within me to just see this phenomenal design that we are. And what an incredible wisdom it is, these survival states that we go into. So I don't want to call them bad. This is not bad. They are there for a reason, to protect us. But it's about all of us paying attention to, as we said, self-awareness. What state is your nervous system in? And what can you do in order to bring yourself back into a state of calm and connection? That's called self-regulation. And here's the important thing. When you come to me as your colleague, as your friend, and I'm dysregulated, I'm likely to dysregulate you too, unless you've got a pretty robust nervous system. But if I am in a state of regulation, I can help to co-regulate you. If you come to me frazzled, and I am grounded in my connection and in my power, then I can help to calm you and bring you into a state of connection, right? And so this is one of the critical things that we need to learn in the health industry and in the health sector. How can we all learn to self-regulate so that we can co-regulate? It's what trauma-informed leadership is all about. And I think it's one key thing that we need to be implementing at a policy, cultural, organizational, as well as individual levels.
To add on to that, which was powerful, and thank you, Rola, because it's really important. I just want to add on to one particular point of it, because I think it's a way for people to grasp this. For those of us who are a little older, you maybe remember these things called radios. And you tuned the dial and you got at a certain number, you got a certain type of music. And if you tuned it this way, you got rock music, and you tuned it that way. So 95.3, you got pop. At 96.7, you got rock. At 98.2, you got classical. Those are radio stations that were vibrating, resonating at a certain frequency, and your radio set tuned to meet that dial. And when you went to 98.5, which is the classical station, you always got classical. And when you went to 95.3, you always got pop. I mean, whatever numbers you want to choose. But whatever those stations were set at, that's what you got. If you've set normal to chaos in your brain, and you're always tuned into that, and you suddenly get calm, it feels weird. It feels wrong. That's what you got to know. If you're operating in a traumatized, overstimulated state all the time, calm feels wrong. You have to regulate yourself. Now, the key to that, again, self-awareness. You got to do the work. I'm sorry, you got to do the work. There's no way around it. I know you'd like to think there isn't, particularly maybe you're a healthcare worker in the psychological side, and you maybe went and got a psychological degree so that you would never have to look at your own poop. But you got to look at your own poop, right? You got to self-examine, right? You will not be cured by learning about others. You've got to deal with your own stuff. So you got to get in there. Now, when you tune that radio station to that dial, the station is broadcasting and you're receiving at the same frequency modulation. Well, there is something called empathetic resonance. Empathetic resonance is when you resonate with another person at what they're feeling. Now, if you feel like you're an over-empathetic individual, it simply means you tune into people. Now, I'm not talking about that in a woo-woo sense. This is heart math. You can do the research on it yourself. There's all kinds of wonderful research on it. And so, as Rola was saying, if you want to serve, one of the ways you can serve is by regulating yourself, by bringing your resonance into a calm state, because you impact others. Listen, when I was a kid and I put the key in the door, I had to know what mood my mom was in on the other side of that door before I opened the door. Did that make me psychic? No, it made me hypervigilant. I learned how to pay attention to things other people didn't notice. You have to be willing to pay attention to yourself, because you've likely, particularly if you're traumatized, learned how to regulate, how to tune into others. You become very empathetic, but you've not got self-resonance. So it's important that when you start to become the self-knowledge and you start to regulate yourself, you then begin to resonate that out to others. And you'll find people are pulled to you, not to fix their problem and then add to the trauma, but just going, you know, I'm freaking out here. What do I do? And you're not coming up with a solution. You're not there to be the solution, which is probably what you've been running. You're there to be the calming force. So you say, hold on a sec. We can address that. Have you breathed? Well, of course I'm breathing. No, can you actually just breathe? Follow me. And they go, what do you mean? Just do what I do.
Dov, there was a poem written by a guy named Matty Stepanek, who's sadly no longer with us. He had a muscular dystrophy, as I recall. And in the wake of one of the urban disturbances in America, this 13-year-old poet wrote a poem, Can We All Just Breathe? And it was all about stop reacting, take a second. And my goodness, what great advice when asked to do something. I remember being a junior doctor and your pages constantly going off. Can you come here? Can you do that? Can you do this? And the faster you ran, the more it was like, it was frenetic. And you absolutely set your thermostat way the hell off the end of the scale. So Nigel, as a practicing family doctor, at a time when many doctors are leaving the profession, you're not only still hard at work, but you clearly love what you do. How do you avoid feeling stressed and becoming burnt out? What are your tactics? And then Roland, Dov, pithy answers, right? Because we're coming towards the end of this. Pithy answers, you know, like bullet points. What can we do? Nigel, take it away.
So I recognized a time ago that I was in one of these spirals, and I decided to do something about it. And being senior professional, I was able to do something about it. So I reduced my hours, and I reduced my hours to a level that I could do a good job, enjoy it, and also cope with it. But the other things I did, I learned to say no sometimes rather than just saying yes all the time. I started being kind to myself, you know, little bits that were just kind to me, and taking time out for myself. And after God knows how many years, taking some time out to just think and reflect some time, and to realize you could actually do that. And a thing that people don't give you permission, I guess, to do. And that has worked for me.
Wonderful.
So what about you, Rola? Anything to add to what Nigel said? Bullet points.
I think there's things that we need to do in order to try and prevent it. And then there's what to do when you get to burnout. So maybe I'll just talk about the preventing, because that's what Nigel was talking about now.
The next one is going to be bullet points on, so someone's burnt out, yourself or your colleague. So let's do this first.
So I just want to highlight the being kind to yourself. And I just want to, like, again, stretch that out and put some neon lights on it. Like it was becoming self-compassionate that cracked me open, started the flow of my river of tears, and actually really catalyzed my healing. I think so many of us are driven by the stick, not by the carrot. We are self-critical, we are judgmental, we are frankly effing nasty to ourselves. And we think compassion is what we put for our patients and not for ourselves. Wrong. And actually we need to be teaching that at medical school, as well as junior doctors and frankly for all of us. So for sure that. I think we need a couple of paradigm shifts. To use your aviation analogies, we need to learn to put the oxygen mask on ourselves first. And for that to be our best strategy. Athletes spend so much time looking after themselves to be best in their best performance. We have people's lives in our hands. We also need to be in our best selves, which means prioritizing ourselves, our health, our wellness, our growth, our evolution. And the other paradigm shift is around this crazy 24/7 mentality. It is not a marathon. It is a relay. We need to, when it's our turn with the baton, run and run, run and run fast. But then we hand it over and we stop and we rest and we recharge and we play and we train. And we know that this is a team sport. This is not an individual sport. That means I look after you and you look after me, and we communicate when each other are struggling and we share in each other's joy. So those, I think, are big paradigm shifts that we need to do within us, because these are like individual issues, our own limiting beliefs, our own glass ceilings, but they are there at a cultural level, and we really need to tackle those and change those if we are to change this burnout culture that we are all part of.
Dov, your bullet points.
My bullet points are everything everybody said is absolutely on point. And what I would just add to that, this is in prevention. This is to make yourself aware so that you don't get to that place. Number one, breathe every day. I mean, actually stop, create a pause and breathe. Do 4, 5, 6 box breaths, 4 in, 4 hold, 4 out. 3, 4, 5 times a day. Just stop, just for no reason, right? You're going to the toilet, instead of scrolling on your phone, do box breathing. Scrolling on your phone isn't helping. Box breathe. That's one. Next one is this: journal. My God, please journal. We've all resisted it. I resisted it for years. I've got a whole library full of journals. And people go, well, do you read those? I do sometimes, but mostly no, because they're there for me to vomit. You don't go digging around in the vomit that you've just done. This is my emotional vomit. I want to get it out there so that I can see it for what it is, and I can put it in perspective so that I don't go into burnout. It's a way for me to have a voice, have my voice, my inner voice come out on paper. And the key to journaling is it must be uncensored. So this is not for other people to read. And if you're fearful of other people reading it, find a journal, write it, put it somewhere that people can't find it. But please, please journal. Next thing, play. Find a way to play every day, whatever play means to you. It might be squash, it might be tennis, it might be a physical play. But for me, I play in my garden. Deadheading my flowers is play. I play with my grandchildren. I chase my little granddaughter around the living room, right? I mean, it's just play, find a way to play. And on top of that, this is the key piece, and this will also fit into the next part, which is community. Human beings are tribal. We need a tribe. We need to belong. Where we get stressed is when we try to fit in rather than belonging. This is a big part of my work. But you need to find a place that will honor you and you can honor others. And as Rola talked about before, we disassociate when we get too stressed. We pull away from, and we've got to push ourselves to connect to. So find a community. And you go, well, I just don't know anybody. I don't have time. Then you need to stop and find a community, whether that's a physical community that you can actually meet with, which would be great. And maybe it's just going for a walk. Or maybe it's an online community of people under a group. You can look them up online, and they're called Burned Out Medical Workers, right? Do they exist? Yeah, they kind of do. I know of an organization that I think, what are they called now? The Reticular Formation, I think they're called, or something. It's some weird name anyway. They're going to have a community for people like that. You might want to check them out because you need community. It's not just about learning. That's important. Growth, it's important. Curiosity, incredibly important. It's life's blood. But you got to have a community that supports you in that.
That's brilliant. It's interesting. We've talked about prevention. We've talked about causes. We're starting to touch on some of the treatments, I guess, to use a clinical term. So if someone is truly burnt out, they've identified it, someone's helped to identify it for them, and they're recognizing that, what are the next steps? What do you do about it? Rola, do you want to start with that?
Yes, absolutely. When I do this work with my clients, the first thing that we do is work on what I call trauma intention release. And that's really about putting into place simple micro practices that help you to start to get your nervous system into a state of regulation. It's also about using and exploring different therapeutic modalities. I found breathwork and psychedelic therapy, for example, extremely effective at doing the internal spring clean that frankly we all need to do when you've arrived at that state of burnout. So that is really, really critical. And that can take months. So you have to be gentle and patient with yourself. It's taken you years to get to this devastating state. So it will take a while to do that. So trust in yourself and get yourself a therapist or a coach or someone who can be with you on this journey. The other thing that I talk about with my clients is just developing a few holistic, healthy habits. You know, we are multidimensional beings. We are a body, but we are a mind, heart, and soul. And so, you know, maybe you're not moving your ass. You can start to do a 5-10 minute HIIT exercise, or maybe you're not meditating, or whatever it is. It's really about, as Dov said, finding the thing that brings you joy and doing it. Because overwhelm isn't just about cutting down on things. It's about doing more of the things that energize us and that inspire us and that give us joy. So that's really, I think, the big thing about getting back into a state of balance and calm and positivity is the compassion, as we talked about, and developing some of these self-care routines, some of these holistic habits, some of these nervous system regulation. Once you're in a state of calm, I think then it's about sitting there and really going, okay, how do I create long-lasting changes? What is this vision of myself and of my future self and of the world that I want? What are my values so that I can live aligned in that way every single day? What inspired action can I take every single day so that I'm there contributing, being of service, but I'm not taking on the major issues of the world? So I think it's really that there's two phases. There's a recovery phase, and then you can build on that to make that longer lasting.
Dov, what's your view? Or your approach, as I say.
Yeah, my approach is this. In order to develop the level of self-compassion that's necessary, one of the things I ask my clients to do is to just stop and say, whatever's going on isn't new. So that's the first thing you got to get. Oh, I'm traumatized and it's because I've gone through a pandemic. No. The pandemic has brought it to the surface. You know, let's use the example of wealth. When people say, oh, you know, she's changed since they became wealthy. No, they've not. They've not changed at all. It's revealed them. The traumatic state reveals you. It doesn't change you, it reveals you. It lets you surface what was underneath that you've buried and needs to come to the surface. So whatever's going on, that's the first thing I want you to look at is, okay, what if this is not new? It's just now magnified, so I have to, it's screaming for my attention, and I've got to pay attention to it. And if I ignore it, it'll only come back bigger and bigger. So that's the first thing. Then I say this. I want you to imagine that you're standing in a room with your little self. Your little self might be 3, 4, 5, 10, 15 years old, but it's, you know, probably under the teens, so 13 and younger. And that child, ask that child if they're feeling anything that seems similar to what you're feeling. How do you now feel that this kid is going through that? If this was a kid that was a kid, you walked into a room and you saw another child who was in that state that you're feeling now, what would you do? And we go, well, first thing I do is take the kid out of the situation. Yeah, isn't that interesting? You take the child out of the situation, but you won't take yourself out. You say, I said, well, would you allow your own child to be in that situation? Absolutely not. Then why would you not have compassion for the fact that you were in that state when you were a child? You can have compassion for somebody else's child. You can have compassion for your own child, but you can't have compassion for the child you were. If you want to recognize where trauma leads to burnout, start with that self-compassion, because that lack of self-compassion has given you a set of values and beliefs based on an identity that was there for your survival rather than for your thriving. So you have to stop and say, well, hold on a second. What are my values? And I make a distinction here. What are my values? Because those are the things I've inherited. And then saying, what are my maxims? My values are inherited. People say family is a value for me. Well, okay, that's societally invested. but what's yours? What really matters to you? What is the meaning of your life? We call it the anatomy of meaning. What is it that gives your life such juice, such excitement, that even in this, you can find something beautiful. You can find something magnificent in this horrendous situation that you may not have been able to save 20 lives, but you saved one. How did you save that one life? Because sometimes that one life is saved not by your medical skills, but by your love, by your compassion, by your caring. M. Scott Peck wrote a book called The Road Less Traveled in the 80s. It was a fantastic book. M. Scott Peck was a medical psychiatrist, military medical psychiatrist. So, pretty rigid. And he said in our training, and I had, same training for me when I became a therapist, was, you're supposed to, as you guys are as doctors, you're supposed to step back and not get emotionally involved. And Peck, when I was in my training and I read Peck's book, I went, oh my God, this guy's got it. He goes, I won't work with somebody I can't fall in love with. It's not romantic. It's about loving and caring. But if you now think of yourself as being in a loving relationship with somebody, how can you be loving to them if you're not loving to yourself? How hard is it for people to love you if you're beaten up on yourself all the time, if you're exhausted all the time? So part of that treatment is self-care, as Rola spoke about, as you spoke about, Nigel, self-care. And when people say that, it sounds kind of nebulous, like, oh, I'm self-caring. No, that's not it. What is it for you? For me, it's going out in the garden. For me, it's, that's the kind of thing, is walking by the ocean. Whatever it is for you that just brings you to that state of self-care. It's not about a weekend in Switzerland at the spa. It's what can you do in this moment that is self-loving? And if you're not sure, ask that child who lives within you. Because in multidimensional reality, in Hugh Everett III's M theory of quantum physics, that kid still exists. So in your mind, you picture yourself going back into that reality and loving that child and giving that child what it would need. Because if you don't, you'll find ways to re-traumatize yourself. Mm-hmm. That's a whole big bag to open up. We're not going to go there, but it's a way for you to start recognizing yourself and treating your overwhelm now with breath, with community, with love.
Thanks, Dov. John, anything to add to that?
Well, as they're speaking, I'm making mental notes to myself, and then I'm thinking, oh no, cover that. I'm going to reference one other book, Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse 5, Schlachthaus 5, which talks about the multidimensionality of life. And boy, it's telling. And if one end of the beast is traumatized, the whole beast is traumatized. You also mentioned tribe. And yes, the reticular formation, the name was chosen because of the function of those brain structures. And because Nigel and I and our other founders understand how life has affected us. And we wanted to create a tribe. Mm-hmm. We wanted to create a community. I know that word is oft used, and it's a place for people to come to and interact and ask us what we can do to help. And that would be my takeaway. As we've gone through this discussion, a number of themes have been made clear: understanding and recognizing burnout, appreciating the harm it can do to our physical, mental health, and our social health, and steps that we can take to prevent and treat the condition. In the coming months, Dov and Rola, who you can learn more about in the notes for this webinar and on our website, are going to be providing you with a range of assets that they've hinted at to help you in many aspects of your life. And I will put my hand up and say, Dov helped me at a time where I remember when he told me to journal, and I said, yeah, no, I don't do that. And when he started talking to me, and he'd given me a book and a pen, and I'm giving him stink eye, 20 minutes later, I couldn't write fast enough. And it was an opinion telling me I'm a professor of surgery. I can't be told anything. I know. I felt like that little boy again. And publicly, I'll say, thank you, Dov. And as I've gotten to know Rola and understood what a truly compassionate and altruistic human being can do when they really understand who they are. So please keep your eyes peeled and register at the reticularformation.com and stay in touch. You know, we were going to take some questions, but time is not on our side. So what we're going to do is have another webinar. All we will do is answer your questions in real time. But what I'd like to do in closing is to ask each of our folks, me, myself included, but I'm tricky here, I've thought this through. I want each of you to come up with a one-sentence takeaway. And because I've known Nigel the longest, I'm going to make him go first, then Dov, then Rola, and then I'll finish up.
Thanks for that.
I'm being kind to myself.
Well, exactly. That is exactly the point. It is about being kind to yourself and to take some time out to do the thing you don't do very often. And that's just to think. Don't force yourself to think. Just give yourself time and you will think. So valuable, I find.
And you're very good at it. And you've been a wise counsel to me over the years. And in fact, a weekend ago, we went out for a walk and you took my phone away from me. You wouldn't have to look at my phone. Bless
and
you.
If you're very good, you'll get it back.
Dov, you're up next.
You know, it's the byline of everything that I do, which is stay curious. I say, stay curious, my friends, stay curious. What does that mean? It means think about all the ways in which you are rigid, all the ways in which you think you know, and instead become curious about what you might not know about the thing you know. You're a medical profession, you understand the way the body works, but what don't you know? Become curious about how your body, how you're ignoring the signs of burnout. Become curious about that child who lives within you. Become curious about the values that you've adopted versus the maxims that are true to your heart and your soul. Become curious about how you can serve yourself so that you can serve others. Become deeply, deeply curious about everything. Watch any child who is healthy. They are deeply curious. They drive you mad because they always want to know why. And it's so endearing and so delicious. Become curious. Stay curious, my friend. Stay curious about how you can love you a little more. And moreover, how you can be part of this community. I encourage you to do that. And I want you to grasp this. If this resonated with you, by the way, there's nothing scripted about this. I just want you to know. If this resonated with you, you know people who are burned out. You have to get them to the Reticular Formation. You have to get them to this platform because we're here to serve you, serving you so that you can help each other. We need a community. And as Rola said, we need that to be leadership, which is by example. So please let other people know, bring them in, lead by example so that we've all got a resource. We all need that. Remember, you're not alone. And that's my tip to you. You're not alone unless you make yourself alone. Don't hoard it, bring others in.
You know, my new motto has become the Rumi poem. Yesterday, I was clever, so I tried to change the world. Today, I am wise, so I'm changing myself. We cannot heal the world if we are deeply wounded. So please put the oxygen mask on yourself first. Physician, heal thyself. And if I or the Reticular Formation can do anything to assist you on this journey, please know that we are here. You are not alone.
I love that quote, Rola. Very uplifting. Mine is a little bit darker. Hamlet said, "The heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to, 'tis a consummation devoutly to be wished." And he was, of course, talking about suicide being an escape from the traumas of life. Let's devoutly wish for something better. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Rola Hallam and Dov Baron for their participation and all that they do to help others and all that they will do to help others here at the Reticular Formation, as well as to the unseen David Weedmark for all his technical prowess, and to you, our audience, for your participation.
Please remember to claim your free Audible book and check out the show notes for details of our wonderful guests. Please also note that the webinar will be archived, so please tell friends to watch and like us on social media. It really helps.
Also, please write to us with suggestions for future webinars or podcasts or content. And we hope to see you back here on the reticularformation.com very soon. Until then, be as kind to yourself as you are to others. Bye for now.